For 35-year-old Sophie Parker, life had settled into a rhythm she thought would carry her forward for decades. 12 years of marriage to John Parker had built a life that felt predictable, if not thrilling. A comfortable condo outside Philadelphia, John's steady income from his corporate job, and the routine of dinners together at the kitchen island, weekend errands, and holiday visits with his colleagues. It wasn't the fairy tale she once dreamed of, but it was steady, and steady had always seemed safe. That's why the moment arrived like thunder, loud, startling, impossible to ignore. John came home early one Tuesday evening, loosened his tie, and sat across from her with the air of a man about to deliver a carefully rehearsed speech. He didn't hesitate. "Sophie, this isn't working anymore. We need to file for divorce." The words landed so simply, like paperwork being shuffled across a desk. Sophie blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Divorce," he repeated, steady, professional. "We've grown apart. I feel like I'm suffocating. You're on autopilot all the time. Just cooking, cleaning, chatting with the neighbors. You're 35, soft, not 70. I don't see growth. I don't see excitement. I need more." Sophie's throat tightened. "John, do you even hear yourself? You're the one who asked me to quit my job. You said your wife shouldn't have to stress, that you wanted a calm, perfect home to come back to. You wanted me to be here, to hold the house together. You made it sound like a gift." His jaw tightened, but he shook his head. "I didn't force you, Sophie. We agreed. It was the right decision at the time." "We didn't agree," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "We fought about it. You wore me down. You didn't like my friends, said they were a distraction, so I cut them off. You didn't want me working long hours, so I left a job I loved. You told me we'd be fine because you made enough money. And now you sit here and say I'm the problem." John exhaled through his nose, the way he did when he was done debating. "It's not about blame. It's about reality. I need to evolve, and I can't do that with you. I've been thinking about this for a long time. It's not sudden." Sophie's chest ached, but something deeper, intuition, instinct, pressed forward. She steadied herself. "Is there someone else?" John looked away. His silence was louder than anything. His ears flushed pink, his mouth tightened. That was all the answer she needed. "There isn't there," she whispered. Finally he muttered, "Yes. Ife a Mitchimwan." The words hollowed her out. Sophie stared at him, this man she had built her life around, who now spoke as casually as if he were announcing a business transfer. "After everything, you throw me away for what?" "Some woman who makes you feel young again." He bristled. "Don't diminish this. She's not a fling. She's someone I connect with in ways we never did. She sees me. She makes me feel alive." Sophie swallowed back the sting of tears. "So 12 years mean nothing?" "Of course they mean something," John said, but his tone was too even, too detached. "But we have no kids. The condo is mine from before the marriage. So legally it's separate property. There isn't much to fight over. Pennsylvania is a no-fault state. We can make this clean, simple. No courtroom battles. You'll get support to land on your feet." Her hands trembled against the cool granite countertop. "Support," she repeated, almost laughing. "You think tossing me an envelope of cash makes this right?" "I'm trying to make it easier," he said, leaning forward, as if logic could erase cruelty. "You need a fresh start. You have that old family house in the Poconos, your inheritance from your grandparents. It's yours, free and clear. Go there. Fix it up. Think about what's next. You'll have time to breathe." Sophie's mind flashed to the farmhouse she hadn't stepped foot in for years. Clapboard siding weathered gray, porch railings rotted through. The smell of hay and dust she used to run from as a girl. She had left it behind for a reason. That house was the past, lonely, rural, suffocating. "You're sending me away like I'm some burden you can't wait to drop," she said, her voice low but steady. I'm offering you stability, John countered, his tone softening as if he believed himself magnanimous. 1 week. Take what you need. I'll wire money to get you started. Please don't drag this out. We both know it's over. He stood then, straightened his tie, and walked toward the door with the efficiency of a man heading to his next meeting. The door clicked shut, leaving Sophie in silence. She sat at the kitchen island, staring at the untouched dinner she'd made earlier, the smell of roasted chicken now nauseating. On the bookshelf, their wedding photo, sunlit, smiling, naive, stared back at her. Slowly, deliberately, she turned the frame face down. For the first time in 12 years, the condo felt foreign, like a hotel room after checkout. Her marriage had ended not with a storm of rage, but with a calculated conversation and a proposal to disappear into the hills. And as the night pressed in around her, Sophie realized she would have to go back to that old farmhouse in the Pocono Hills. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. Sophie moved through the condo like a guest at the end of a long stay, folding clothes into boxes, stacking plates with mechanical precision. The envelope John had left, crisp bills banded together, sat in her purse like both an insult and a lifeline. She hated the thought of spending his money, but she also knew she had little choice. There was no job waiting for her, no apartment in her name. What she had was the farmhouse in the Pocono Hills, a property she hadn't touched in over a decade. By Saturday, her small SUV was packed to the roofline, the back window nearly blocked by boxes labeled with her neat handwriting. She paused at the door of the condo, glancing once more at the empty rooms, the place where her marriage had quietly expired. She didn't cry. The tears had already dried into something sharper. She pulled the door shut and carried herself down to the car without looking back. The drive north stretched long and silent, the hum of the highway filling the void John used to occupy with casual complaints about traffic or updates from the office. Philadelphia gave way to suburbs, then to open stretches of farmland dotted with red barns and faded billboards. As the miles passed, cell service flickered and then vanished, leaving Sophie alone with her thoughts. The closer she came to the mountains, the heavier her chest felt. The sun dipped low by the time she reached the exit marked for the Poconos. The road narrowed, winding into hills that smelled faintly of pine and earth, the evening air cooler than in the city. She remembered childhood trips along this same stretch of road, her face pressed to the window while her parents argued softly in the front seat. Even then, she had promised herself she would leave this place and never return. Now, irony guided her back like a tether. When she finally turned down the gravel drive, her headlights caught the farmhouse. It stood hunched against the trees, a silhouette of neglect. The siding, once white, was gray and peeling. Windows were covered by warped wooden boards. The porch sagged, its railing splintered. The yard was a jungle of weeds and waist-high grass, a tangle of wild growth reclaiming what her grandparents had once tamed. Sophie cut the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the house. The silence pressed in. No neighbors, no hum of traffic, just the sound of crickets and the occasional distant bark of a dog somewhere deeper in the hills. She stepped out, gravel crunching beneath her boots, and pulled her suitcase from the trunk. The air was sharp, earthy, filled with the scent of damp leaves and moss. She walked up the creaking porch steps and slipped the old brass key into the lock. For a moment, she wasn't sure it would turn. Then it clicked, and the door gave way with a long groan, exhaling the smell of dust and stale air. Inside, the house felt frozen in time, yet abandoned. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of her flashlight. A moth fluttered against the wall, disturbed from its hiding place. The kitchen table was still there, draped in a thin film of grime. Cabinets hung crooked, and in one corner, a spider web stretched like lace across a broken chair. The air was damp, tinged with mold and something sour. She set her bag down and leaned against the wall, the weight of the place pressing down on her. Memories rose unbidden, Her grandmother bent over the stove, the smell of cornbread in the oven, her mother pulling weeds with hands red from the soil. Sophie herself, younger, running barefoot through the yard only to trip and scrape her knee on the gravel. She had hated it, the endless chores, the isolation, the way the field stretched like a prison. She had sworn to escape, and she had. Until now, the house groaned in the wind, reminding her that this was no sentimental visit. This was where she had to live, at least for now. She wandered through the rooms, opening doors cautiously. The living room held a sagging couch, its cushions gnawed by mice. The bedroom upstairs was worse. Cobwebs thick in the corners, floorboards warped from years of damp. Still, she dragged her suitcase up the narrow stairs and unzipped it, laying out sheets on the least stained mattress she could find. As night fell, the farmhouse seemed to shrink around her. The walls whispered with the scurry of small animals. The roof ticked as it cooled. Sophie lay in bed, the thin blanket pulled up to her chin, and listened. Every creak made her flinch. She missed the city's background noise, the distant sirens, the hum of cars. Out here, the silence was too complete, broken only by the lonely sound of an owl calling through the trees. For the first time since John's announcement, Sophie allowed herself to admit the truth. She was afraid, not just of the house or of being alone, but of the blank future waiting to be written. 12 years of marriage had ended with a conversation over dinner. Now she lay in a bed that smelled of mildew, staring at a ceiling she once thought she'd never see again. She pressed her hand against her chest, steadying her breath. The farmhouse was hers. It might be crumbling, but it was all she had left. And somehow, she would have to make it into a beginning instead of an ending. Morning light leaked through the cracks in the boarded windows, thin and pale, cutting across the dust that hung heavy in the air. Sophie lay awake on the sagging mattress, staring at the ceiling. Sleep had come in fits, each creak of the old farmhouse pulling her back into alertness. By dawn, her body ached, but her mind was sharper than it had been in days. Reality was no longer something she could postpone. She had no job, no savings of her own, no friends in the city willing or able to cushion her fall. 12 years as a housewife had left her with a blank resume and a tenure hole she could never explain away in an interview. Who would hire her now? A grocery store cashier? A gas station clerk? She could already picture the pitying stares of managers half her age. The thought of selling the farmhouse drifted across her mind like a desperate solution. If she could unload it, even for a fraction of its value, maybe she could scrape together enough for a tiny apartment back near Philadelphia, pick up part-time work, and slowly rebuild. But she knew the truth before the fantasy even finished forming. No one was lining up to buy a rotting house tucked into the Poconos. The boards on the windows were warning signs as clear as any. Realtors would laugh. Buyers wanted mountain cabins with decks and lake views, not a decaying family relic overrun with weeds. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her knees. That meant the farmhouse was not an escape hatch. It was her only lifeline. And if she was going to survive, she had to make it livable, maybe even profitable. Ideas flickered, timid but insistent. She had always loved flowers, even as a girl, arranging wild daisies in jars when her grandmother's garden bloomed, sneaking into the yard after school to braid stems together. Could she take a class, maybe in floral design? Open a shop someday? The thought felt ridiculous, like a dream out of reach, but it stirred something warm. Or maybe she could work the land. Everyone in these hills seemed to have a side hustle, selling homemade jam at farmers markets, keeping a few goats for milk, raising chickens for eggs. A homestead. She tried to picture herself hauling buckets of feed, trimming raspberry bushes, kneading dough for bread to sell at the Saturday market in town. The image was foreign, but also strangely grounding. Sophie stood, brushed the dust from her jeans, and walked to the front of the house. The boards nailed over the windows stared back at her, as though sealing her away from the outside world. Her fingers traced the splintered wood. This was what John had meant when he said she was stuck. He'd boxed her in, and she'd let him. But she didn't have to keep living that way. She found the toolbox her grandfather had left behind, rusted but intact, tucked in the corner of the shed. Inside was a crowbar, still sturdy. She gripped it with both hands, braced herself, and wedged the metal tip beneath the first board. It resisted at first, creaking, but then gave with a sharp crack. Dust rained down, stinging her eyes, but light poured through the gap. Her chest rose with something fierce, almost defiant. She pried off another board, and another, until the window stood open, sunlight spilling into the room. The farmhouse smelled of mold and age, but the light transformed it, turning shadows into possibilities. She moved to the next window, muscles burning, sweat trickling down her back. With each board she tore away, the house seemed to breathe again, and so did she. By the time she stopped, exhausted and covered in grime, the rooms glowed with natural light for the first time in years. Sophie stood in the middle of the kitchen, hair damp against her temples, hands raw from the crowbar, and looked around. It was still a ruin. Dust piled in corners, wallpaper peeling in strips, mice droppings scattered along the floorboards. But it was no longer a tomb. It was a beginning. She filled a bucket from the pump in the yard, hauled it back inside, and began scrubbing the counters. The water turned black almost instantly, but she dumped it and filled another. The rhythm steadied her. Each swipe of the rag clearing more than just dirt. By evening, the kitchen bore the faintest resemblance to a place someone might live. When she finally collapsed into the rickety chair by the window, Sophie caught sight of the hills rolling beyond the property line. The setting sun painted them gold, and for the first time since John had uttered the word divorce, she felt a thread of control winding its way back into her hands. She whispered to herself, barely audible over the cicadas, "If I can open a window, I can open a door." The farmhouse creaked in agreement, as though it, too, had been waiting for someone to believe it could live again. The next morning, Sophie pulled on work gloves that were already fraying at the seams. A broom leaned against the wall, and beside it, a stack of boards she'd ripped from the windows the day before. Sunlight streamed freely now, cutting across the kitchen and catching the dust in golden rays. For the first time, the farmhouse felt less like a mausoleum and more like a place that could breathe. She carried another armful of debris toward the porch, the boards scraping her forearms. That's when she heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel drive. Sophie froze, heart hammering. John had promised not to drag this out, but some part of her still feared he might show up, smug and patronizing, to check on his abandoned wife. "Hey!" a man's voice called sharply. "What are you doing there?" Sophie spun around, boards clattering to the porch floor. A tall man stood at the edge of the yard, framed by the overgrown weeds. He wore a red and blue plaid shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows and jeans scuffed with dirt. A broad-shouldered figure with a stern face shadowed by the morning sun. At his side trotted a sandy-colored dog with a curled tail, ears pricked forward in alert curiosity. Sophie's pulse quickened. "Excuse me." The man took a few steps closer, his voice edged with suspicion. "This house has been empty for years. You can't just break in." Her indignation rose. She yanked off a glove and straightened. "I didn't break in. This is my house." His brow furrowed. "Your house?" "Yes. I'm Sophie Parker. My grandparents own this place. She exhaled, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I moved back in yesterday." The man studied her for a long moment. Then his expression softened, suspicion giving way to something like recognition. "Parker," he repeated. "You're Margaret Parker's granddaughter?" Sophie nodded cautiously. The man let out a breath and chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought this place would never see life again." He stepped forward and extended a hand. "Name's Daniel Whitmore. I live about a mile down the road. Built my house after the divorce." Sophie hesitated, then shook his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, the kind of hand that belonged to someone who worked with tools more than keyboards. The dog wagged its tail and padded up the porch steps, sniffing Sophie's shoes before sitting squarely at her feet as though deciding she belonged. "And this," Daniel said, nodding toward the dog, "is Russell. He usually doesn't take to strangers, but looks like you've passed his test." Sophie crouched, scratching gently behind the dog's ears. Russell leaned into her touch with a satisfied huff. A surprising warmth spread through her chest. "He's beautiful," she murmured. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, watching her with a small smile. "So, you're moving back in here. Brave choice." "Not much of a choice," Sophie admitted, standing again. "It's all I've got left." His gaze flicked over the sagging porch, the boarded windows she hadn't reached yet, the jungle of weeds choking the yard. "Well, you've got your work cut out for you. But it's not impossible. I know. Did the same thing myself a few years back." "You rebuilt your house?" "Built it from scratch," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "After my ex left, I needed something that was mine. So I bought land, laid the foundation, and got my hands dirty. Figured if my life was starting over, my house should too." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a plain-spoken honesty that caught Sophie off guard. He nodded toward the pile of boards at her feet. "Need a hand? You'll break your back doing this alone." Sophie opened her mouth to protest, instinct telling her not to lean on anyone, not again, but the sincerity in his eyes made the refusal catch in her throat. "I wouldn't say no to advice," she admitted. Daniel grinned, pushing off the railing. "Advice comes free. Labor costs a cup of coffee." Sophie laughed softly, the sound surprising her. It had been days since she'd laughed, maybe weeks. "Deal." He walked the perimeter with her, pointing out weak spots on the roofline, where to patch leaks, which boards were salvageable. His voice was steady, practical, and carried the ease of someone who didn't mind hard work. Russell padded faithfully beside them, occasionally darting into the weeds, only to circle back, tail wagging. As they stood by the back porch, Daniel glanced at Sophie, his expression thoughtful. "You know, your grandmother was one of the kindest women in these hills. Helped folks whether she had the time or not. If you've got even half her grit, this place will stand tall again." Sophie felt the sting of tears at the corners of her eyes, but blinked them back. She wasn't ready to cry in front of a stranger. Still, something about his words struck deep, as though he'd given her permission to believe the impossible. Daniel clapped his hands together. "All right, tomorrow I'll swing by with a ladder and some tools. We'll get these windows cleared properly and see if that pump still works like it should." "You don't have to," she began. "Sure I do," he interrupted, tone light but firm. "Neighbors look out for each other out here. Besides, Russell's already adopted you. I don't argue with him." At that, the dog barked once, as if in agreement. Sophie smiled, the first genuine smile in what felt like forever. Maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face this battle entirely alone. The following week unfolded in rhythms Sophie had almost forgotten her body could hold. Mornings began with the sound of gravel crunching under Daniel's pickup as he pulled into the drive, ladder tied to the roof and Russell bounding out before the engine had even stilled. The dog would run to the porch, tail curled high, greeting Sophie as though she were a long-lost friend. And in a way, she was lost and slowly being found again. Together, Sophie and Daniel tore away the remaining boards that had sealed the house like a tomb. With each plank that clattered to the ground, more sunlight streamed inside, warming the rooms that had sat dark for too long. Daniel showed her how to pry nails without splitting the wood, how to brace her foot for leverage. His instructions were patient, his laughter easy when she cursed under her breath at stubborn beams. When the windows finally opened wide, Sophie stood back, hair sticking to her temples with sweat, and marveled at the view she hadn't seen in years. Rolling hills draped in summer green, pines crowding the horizon, the sky so wide it seemed to swallow her whole. For the first time since John's words had shattered her world, Sophie felt her lungs expand with something more than grief. She felt possibility. The work carried them into other tasks. Daniel tested the wiring, flicking breakers until a faint hum of electricity returned. "Needs updating," he said, "but it'll get you through." They dragged buckets of water from the pump, and when it sputtered to life with a rusty groan, Sophie laughed, an unguarded, uncalculated sound that startled her as much as it delighted Daniel. The roof became their next battle. Sophie steadied the ladder while Daniel climbed, hammer in one hand, shingles tucked under his arm. Russell lay sprawled in the grass below, tongue lolling, keeping vigil as if supervising the project. Sophie looked up at Daniel silhouetted against the sky, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat, and wondered how long it had been since she'd seen someone pour so much of themselves into something without complaint. In the evenings, when the tools were put away and the sun sank low, Daniel would sit with her on the porch steps, a thermos of coffee between them. It was during those quiet hours that his story began to unfold. "My ex-wife left when our daughter was 10, he said one night, voice even, as if he'd rehearsed it so many times it no longer cut sharp. She said she needed freedom, a chance to live the life she'd missed. I fought to keep our girl and I won. Raised her myself. She's 20 now in nursing school downstate." Sophie turned toward him, surprise flickering across her face. "You raised her alone?" He nodded, sipping from the thermos. "It wasn't easy, but you figure things out when you have to. I built the house I live in now with my own hands. Thought if I could give her stability, maybe she wouldn't feel abandoned the way I did when her mom left." The honesty in his voice was steady without self-pity. Sophie admired it, though it stirred an ache in her chest. "And now? Do you ever hear from your ex?" Daniel shrugged. "Once in a while. Birthdays, maybe a holiday card. But she's living her life somewhere else. And we're doing fine without her." He looked at Sophie then, not with pity but with recognition. Being left behind doesn't mean you're finished. Sometimes it just means you've been set free. The words hung between them, more comforting than any platitude she'd heard since John's betrayal. Sophie hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them until they landed in her bones like truth. The days blurred into a rhythm of labor and companionship. Sophie scrubbed walls until her arms ached, patched curtains from old fabric, and swept floors that had forgotten what clean felt like. Russell followed her from room to room, sprawling at her feet when she finally collapsed into a chair, his quiet presence a balm against the loneliness that had haunted her since leaving the city. And in those long hours of work, Sophie discovered something she hadn't expected: joy. Not the fleeting, artificial kind she once chased through mall shopping trips or dinner reservations, but the quiet, sustaining joy of building something with her own hands. Each layer of dust she swept away, each board she sanded, felt like a reclamation of herself. One evening, as fireflies lit the yard and the cicadas sang their endless chorus, Sophie looked at Daniel across the porch. He was tired, hair damp with sweat, but his eyes were bright with something steady, something safe. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me, for not treating me like I'm broken." Daniel tilted his head, his smile gentle. "You're not broken, Sophie. You're just getting started again. Big difference." Russell barked once, as if to underline the point, then rested his head on Sophie's knee. She scratched his ears, heart swelling. For the first time in a long while, she no longer felt like she was only surviving. She was beginning to live again. It was late on a Thursday when Sophie and Daniel finally called it a day. They had spent hours clearing brush from the side yard, pulling out roots that had knotted deep into the soil, and hauling broken furniture from the upstairs rooms to the porch. The farmhouse looked less like an abandoned ruin and more like a place preparing to be lived in. They sat on the steps, the twilight stretching across the hills, painting the horizon in lavender and rose. Russell lay sprawled at Sophie's feet, belly rising and falling in the rhythm of a dog exhausted by loyalty. Sophie took the thermos of coffee Daniel handed her, the metal warm against her palms, and stared at the line of trees swaying in the evening wind. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the kind that carried comfort rather than awkwardness. Finally, Sophie drew in a breath, her voice unsteady. "Do you ever wonder if it was all for nothing?" Daniel glanced at her, brow creasing. "What do you mean?" "My marriage," she said, eyes fixed on the horizon. 12 years, and at the end of it, John sat me down and told me I was boring, that I'd stopped being attractive, that I wasn't growing. He said I lived like a robot. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "And the worst part is he made me into that person. He pushed me to quit my job, to give up my friends, to build my whole world around him. Then he turned around and blamed me for being exactly what he asked for." Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. "He admitted there's another woman, some perfect connection, some spark I couldn't give him. He spoke about her like he'd found the answer to his life. And I was just a mistake he'd outgrown." Daniel didn't interrupt. He let the words spill out, let them hang in the dusk air until Sophie felt emptied. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady. "I know what that feels like." She turned, surprised. "My ex-wife said the same things," Daniel continued, "that she needed freedom, that I was holding her back. Truth was, she'd already found someone else. By the time she walked out, it wasn't even about us anymore. It was about her running toward whatever, or whoever, she thought would save her." He took a sip of coffee, eyes far away. It felt like being shoved off a moving train. One day you think you're heading somewhere together, the next you're just standing alone on the tracks, wondering what you did wrong. Sophie's chest ached at the image. "How did you survive it?" "I didn't, not at first," Daniel admitted. "I was angry, bitter. I drowned myself in work and tried to pretend I didn't care. But raising my daughter forced me to show up day after day. Somewhere along the line, I realized being left wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else." His gaze shifted to her, steady and kind. "Divorce isn't a death sentence, Sophie. It's not the end of your story. It's just a brutal way of turning the page." Her eyes burned, though she refused to let tears fall. "It doesn't feel like a new page. It feels like a blank one I don't know how to write on." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's the hard part. But blank pages are also freedom. You get to choose what comes next, and you don't have to let someone else hold the pen anymore." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt charged, alive with understanding. Sophie felt something loosen in her chest, as though the weight she'd been dragging since that night in the condo had finally shifted. For the first time, she believed she wasn't just broken, she was unfinished. Russell stirred, lifting his head to nuzzle Sophie's hand. She scratched behind his ears, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You make it sound almost simple." "It's not simple," Daniel said, smiling back. "But it is possible." The last of the daylight slipped behind the hills. Daniel stood, stretching his back, then offered his hand to Sophie. "Come on. There's something I want to show you." She hesitated, then placed her hand in his, letting him pull her to her feet. "Where are we going?" "To the river," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something softer, almost nostalgic. "I grew up here. That river was my escape when things got bad at home. After the divorce, I bought the land along its banks, built my house near it. I think you should see it. Remind yourself the world isn't just made of endings." Sophie glanced once at the dark outline of the farmhouse behind her, then at the expanse of hills ahead. For the first time, she felt a flicker of curiosity, even hope. She nodded. "All right, show me." And with Russell trotting faithfully at their side, she followed Daniel down the path that led toward the sound of rushing water, toward a place that would begin to reshape her life. The path to the river wound through tall grass and maples that whispered with the night breeze. Fireflies hovered like tiny lanterns, Winking in and out of sight, Russell bounded ahead, splashing into the shallows before circling back with a joyful bark. Sophie followed Daniel down the slope, the ground soft with moss and roots. When the trees opened, she drew in a breath. The river stretched wide under the moonlight, its surface glimmering silver. The sound of rushing water was steady, soothing, like a heartbeat older than the hills themselves. "This was my refuge growing up," Daniel said, his voice gentler now. "When my parents fought, when school felt too small, I came here. After my divorce, I bought the land to make sure it always stayed mine. It's the one place that's never let me down." Sophie knelt by the bank, letting the cool water slip through her fingers. It carried the scent of pine and stone, washing something heavy from her shoulders. "It feels untouched," she whispered. Daniel laughed softly. "That's because it is. No condos, no traffic, no deadlines. Just this." He kicked off his boots, rolled up his jeans, and waded in until the water lapped at his calves. He turned, grinning. "Come on, Parker. You need this." Sophie hesitated, but his smile coaxed her forward. She slipped off her shoes, rolled her pants, and stepped into the river. The cold hit her ankles like a shock, but then a rush of exhilaration swept through her. She laughed, a sound so pure it startled her. Daniel's grin widened. They waded deeper, the water rising to their knees, then their waists. The current tugged playfully at Sophie's clothes, urging her to let go. She tilted her head back, watching the stars appear one by one, listening to the cicadas sing from the trees. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt unburdened. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying across the water. Sophie nodded, hair damp against her cheeks. "It feels like I can breathe again." Russell barked from the shore, as if cheering them on. Daniel laughed, then swam a few strokes into the deeper part, water cascading down his face when he surfaced. Sophie followed hesitantly, then burst out laughing when the current lifted her feet. She floated on her back, staring up at the vast expanse of stars. Time slipped away, measured only by the river's song. When she finally drifted close to Daniel again, their laughter softened into something quieter, almost reverent. He reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. The touch lingered, warm even against the chill of the river. Sophie met his gaze, and in it she saw not pity or judgment, but recognition, a mirror of her own longing to be seen, to be chosen. He leaned in, slowly, as if giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was neither rushed nor hesitant, but full and certain. It was not the kiss of strangers testing boundaries. It was the kiss of two people who had already built trust through labor, silence, and shared pain. Sophie felt her heart pound, not with fear, but with awakening. She had thought that part of her was dead, buried under years of neglect and betrayal. But here, under the stars, in the arms of a man who had also been broken and rebuilt, she felt alive again. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "You deserve better than what you've been given," he whispered. Her throat tightened, but she smiled. "So do you." They waded back to shore, water dripping from their clothes, hair plastered to their faces. They collapsed onto the grass, laughing breathlessly, Russell circling them with delighted barks before settling at their side. The laughter faded into quiet. Daniel's hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally, like they had always belonged there. He stared out at the river, then back at her, his expression thoughtful. "Sophie," he said slowly, "I don't want to waste time pretending I don't know what this is. You've been through hell, and I know it's fast. But I also know what I feel when I'm around you. I want you to move in with me. Not someday now. I don't want to wait." The words landed heavy and tender all at once. Sophie blinked, her chest tightening. "Daniel, we've only known each other a month." He nodded. "I know, but sometimes you don't need more time. Sometimes you just know. And I know." Her instinct was to retreat, to protect herself from more disappointment. But as she looked at him, at the man who had shown up every morning with tools and patience, who had listened to her pain without judgment, who had opened his world to her without hesitation, she felt the walls inside her bend. She bit her lip, heart racing. "It's crazy." "Maybe," Daniel said, his smile soft, almost shy. "But maybe crazy is exactly what we need." Sophie stared at the river, at the stars mirrored on its surface. She had been abandoned, dismissed, told she was nothing more than a burden. And yet here she was wanted, not for what she could give, but for who she was. Her heart answered before her head could argue. She squeezed his hand gently. She wasn't ready to say yes aloud, not yet, but she didn't pull away either. And that was enough for now. Daniel seemed to understand. He leaned back on the grass, content, and together they watched the river carry the night forward. A year slipped by, though for Sophie it felt less like time passing and more like time returning. The woman who had once sat hollow-eyed in a crumbling farmhouse was gone. In her place stood someone younger in spirit, with light in her eyes and purpose in her hands. With Daniel's steady encouragement, Sophie had enrolled in classes at a floral design studio in Strasbourg. She discovered she had a natural gift for color, balance, and breathing life into arrangements. Soon she was supplying bouquets to local shops and wedding venues. Her name whispered with admiration. Customers didn't see a divorcee rebuilding her life. They saw a professional whose work carried warmth and elegance. Her wardrobe changed too, no longer the resigned jeans and faded sweaters of a forgotten wife, but dresses that highlighted her confidence, pieces chosen not for John's approval, but for her own reflection in the mirror. She moved with ease now, with Russell bounding happily at her side and Daniel never far from reach. So when the embossed invitation arrived, John Parker's 40th birthday celebration, Sophie almost laughed. She had no reason to go, and yet something inside her insisted she must. Not out of spite, but out of closure. To show him, and herself, how far she'd come. On the evening of the party, Daniel's truck pulled up outside the event hall in Allentown, headlights cutting across the manicured parking lot. Sophie stepped down in a gown of deep emerald silk. Her hair swept into loose waves that caught the light. A delicate pendant rested at her collarbone. She looked radiant, like a woman at the height of her power, not someone dragging the chains of the past. Daniel offered his arm, his suit crisp, his presence solid and reassuring. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Sophie smiled, slipping her hand into his. More than ever. Inside, the hall glittered with balloons and chandeliers. Laughter echoed from groups of John's colleagues and acquaintances. Sophie recognized the type. Men in tailored suits bragging about investments, women in polished heels exchanging smiles sharp as glass. And then John appeared, standing near the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand. His hair had thinned, his tie hung slightly loose, and his smile seemed plastered rather than genuine. He looked older than 40, tired in a way success couldn't conceal. He turned, expecting another guest, but froze when his eyes landed on Sophie. For a moment, he didn't even recognize her. The emerald gown shimmered under the lights, her skin glowed, and her laughter with Daniel was unforced, bright. John's mouth parted as if to speak, but no words came. Sophie caught his stare and walked toward him, each step measured, graceful. Daniel's hand rested gently at the small of her back, steady as ever. "John!" Sophie greeted, her voice warm but distant, like one might address an old neighbor. "Happy birthday." He blinked, trying to gather himself. "Sophie? You look." He stopped, unable to finish. "Thank you," she said simply, sparing him the effort. Her smile was polite, not sharp, not vindictive, simply unshakable. The people around John turned, whispering, curious about the woman who commanded the room without trying. John fumbled for composure, adjusting his tie. "I didn't expect. I mean, it's been a while." "Yes," Sophie said. "It has." She let the silence linger, just long enough for him to squirm. Then she tilted her head, eyes softening. I hope life has been kind to you. John's throat worked. It's been fine. But the word rang hollow. Everyone knew his girlfriend had left months ago, whispers of it spreading through the same circles, now clinking glasses in this hall. The man who once thought himself untouchable now stood exposed, alone at his own celebration. Sophie leaned in slightly, her voice lowering but still clear enough to carry. I wanted to thank you, John, for setting me free, for making room in my life for something better. Confusion flickered across his face, replaced quickly by a grim attempt at indifference. Better. She turned toward Daniel, who met her gaze with quiet pride. Sophie's smile softened into something tender. Yes, much better. Her hand brushed lightly over her stomach, the gesture natural, unforced. Daniel and I are expecting. It's early, but I've never been happier. The color drained from John's face, his glass tipped slightly in his hand, liquid trembling at the rim. Around them, the hum of conversation faltered as those nearby caught the words, eyes widening. Sophie didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She simply stood radiant, a woman who had been discarded but had bloomed in the soil where she'd been left. John forced a smile that never reached his eyes. Congratulations, he muttered, but the bitterness cracked through. He looked older still, smaller somehow, like the walls of the hall were closing in. Sophie inclined her head. Thank you. Truly. And then she turned away, her arm linked through Daniel's, her laughter mingling with the music as they rejoined the party. Behind them, John stood rooted in place, staring at the life he had so carelessly thrown away, a life now more vibrant and complete than anything he would ever grasp again. In that moment, the scales balanced, not with shouting, not with revenge plotted in shadows, but with dignity, love, and the undeniable glow of a woman who had reclaimed herself. The party faded into memory with the sound of clinking glasses and John's stunned silence, still lingering like a faint echo. By the time Sophie and Daniel returned to the farmhouse, the moon hung high over the Pocono Hills, casting the yard in silver light. Russell trotted ahead of them, tail swaying, eager to be home. Inside, Sophie slipped out of her gown and hung it carefully, then sat by the window in the soft glow of a lamp. She pressed her hands against her stomach, not yet showing but carrying a promise of the future. The farmhouse around her, once abandoned, dark and suffocating, now hummed with life. Flowers she'd arranged filled the kitchen with color. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the repaired clock in the hall marked time in steady rhythms. She thought back to the woman she had been a year ago, the one John had dismissed as boring, the woman who lay on a sagging mattress, staring at boarded windows and believing her life was over. That woman had been buried in grief, discarded like a book with no more chapters. Yet tonight, Sophie felt the truth with a clarity that made her chest ache. She had not been discarded. She had been replanted. Daniel entered the room quietly, carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He set one beside her and sat across, his eyes soft, steady. You okay? He asked. Sophie nodded, her smile faint but sure. Better than okay. I think I finally understand. Understand what? That ending doesn't mean failure, she said, her voice thoughtful. John leaving wasn't the end of me. It was the end of who I was when I let myself disappear. He thought he broke me, but really he set me free. Daniel reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm, grounding. You set yourself free, Sophie. Don't give him that power. Her eyes shimmered. Maybe, but I couldn't have done it without you, without Russell, without this house reminding me that even ruins can be rebuilt. Russell perked his ears at the mention of his name, patting over to rest his head against her knee. Sophie laughed softly, scratching behind his ears. And him, of course. Their small family, an unexpected constellation of people and a dog, had become something unshakable. Sophie no longer measured her worth in the reflection of John's approval. She measured it in the soil under her fingernails, in the blooms she arranged that carried joy into other people's homes, in the steady love Daniel gave her without condition, and in the quiet life growing inside her. Weeks passed, and Sophie leaned into the rhythm of her new life. Mornings often began with the scent of fresh coffee and Daniel's laughter echoing across the porch. She worked on her floral business, filling orders, attending local markets where her arrangements quickly became favorites. Russell followed her everywhere, occasionally stealing a flower stem and running across the yard, tail high, making her chase him. At night, Sophie and Daniel planned the nursery. They painted the walls soft yellow, set up a crib Daniel had built with his own hands, and hung small mobiles that caught the light. It was a simple space, but to Sophie it felt like a palace. Each brushstroke, each piece of furniture carried the promise of beginnings instead of endings. On quiet evenings, Sophie would walk the property, the air filled with the scent of pine and earth, the sky wide and endless. She thought often of women like her, women who had been told they were too little or too much, who had been pushed aside as if their stories were finished. She wished she could tell them what she now knew. That life after loss wasn't just survival. It was transformation. One golden evening, as summer began to fade, Sophie and Daniel walked hand in hand down the dirt road that curved through the hills. Russell bounded ahead, chasing after crickets in the tall grass. The setting sun draped the world in light, so rich it seemed to bless everything it touched. Sophie paused, taking in the scene, the farmhouse glowing in the distance, the man beside her, the life they had created from brokenness. She turned to Daniel, her voice soft but resolute. "I used to think my story ended the night John left, but it didn't. That was just the prologue. This," she squeezed his hand, eyes shimmering with gratitude. "This is the beginning." Daniel smiled, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. "And it's going to be a damn good one." They stood together for a moment, letting the silence wrap around them, the hills echoing with cicadas, the air warm with the last breath of summer. Then, slowly, they began to walk again, the dirt road stretching out before them like an unwritten page. Behind them lay the ruins of an old life. Ahead lay something new, love steady as the river, roots deep as the pines, and hope rising with every step. And as the sun dipped below the Pocono Hills, Sophie Parker knew she had not been abandoned. She had been reborn. It was a Friday afternoon in late October, just after 4 p.m., when I pulled into the driveway and noticed the envelope taped to our front door. A large manila folder, the kind Mark used to keep house project plans in. Except this one had my name scrawled across the front in bold, uneven ink. Vanessa. No honey, no V, just my name. Cold. Isolated. Lucy barked once from the back seat, tail wagging, unaware her world was about to unravel along with mine. I grabbed the envelope with trembling fingers, trying not to imagine what it contained. But my heart knew before I even stepped inside. The house was silent, too silent. No ambient music playing from the kitchen speaker. No low hum of Mark's sander from the garage. Just the creak of floorboards as I crossed the threshold. I dropped my purse, set Lucy's leash free, and stood there in the hallway, staring at the package like it might explode. I opened it with a letter opener from the drawer. Inside were dozens of printed screenshots, messages between me and Julian, our secret Facebook accounts, coded texts, flirty banter, and at the very back a note, written in my daughter's handwriting. "You're not the mother I thought you were. Don't contact me again. Sienna." That was the moment something inside me collapsed. Not cracked, not bent, collapsed. I sank to the floor, the envelope slipping from my hands like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Lucy patted over and nudged my arm, whining softly, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened like it had been sewn shut with invisible thread. Not Sienna. Anyone but her. I tried to stand, but my knees buckled. I crawled to the living room rug and curled up into myself, shielding my body as if from an attack, though no one was there. Just my mistakes, just my lies, just my daughter's silence echoing louder than any scream. I don't know how long I lay there. An hour? Maybe 2. The sun had dipped low behind the mountains by the time I sat upright, dazed and cold. I reached for my phone with a frantic desperation, dialing Mark first. Straight to voicemail, then Sienna, then Aiden. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. I didn't even try Julian. I knew that door was already closed, maybe even bolted shut on both ends. I texted Mark simply, "Please call me. I can explain." Nothing. I followed it with, "I love you. Please don't shut me out. Please." Still nothing. The next ping I received wasn't from any of them. It was from a blocked number, just minutes before 7 p.m. Vanessa, I know everything. So do the kids. So does my mother. Your parents, too, as of 15 minutes ago. I've moved out. I'll be in touch through my attorney only. Enjoy your new life. Mark. I read it, then reread it, then felt the words burn through my retinas. He told everyone. My children. His mother. My parents. Even my father, who once told me I'd always be his best girl. What would he think now? I screamed into the silence. Loud, gut-wrenching, ugly. It was the kind of scream you didn't care if the neighbors heard. The kind of scream that came from knowing you'd finally gone too far. Upstairs, our bedroom door stood open. I walked toward it slowly as if walking through water. There, on the neatly made bed, was a white gift box with a thick red ribbon. My name was written on the tag. Inside, divorce papers. Not just documents, a declaration. That my family was over. That I had detonated everything. I clutched the box to my chest, fell to my knees, and wept like a child. I wish I could say that was the worst part, but the silence that followed that was worse. The silence of a family disappearing. Not with shouting, not with fury, but with absence. The kind of silence that wraps around your throat and whispers, "This is what you deserve." It's strange what the mind chooses to hold on to when everything else falls apart. In the middle of that unbearable silence, with divorce papers still sitting in the box beside me, I found myself remembering something so ordinary it was from the first week of April, just 6 months earlier. Mark had built me a new garden bench. It wasn't fancy, just reclaimed wood and natural stain, but it was perfect. He'd spent 2 weekends sanding it smooth and carving tiny mountain peaks into the backrest, knowing how I loved the way the Rockies looked at dusk. He never said anything poetic about it. He just grinned, handed me a glass of sweet tea, and said, "Try not to break this one when you get dramatic." And I had laughed. Genuinely. Back then, things were whole. Not perfect. No one's marriage ever really is, but steady, comfortable, safe. Mark worked as a lead consultant for a firm that specialized in eco-friendly construction. He'd helped rebuild schools after the Marshall Fire, and half the town still stopped him at the grocery store to thank him. I was proud of him, maybe too proud. Somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking he could ever be vulnerable or hurt. Our kids, Sienna and Aiden, were both away at college. They'd left that past August for the University of Washington, Sienna majoring in environmental policy like her father, Aiden trying his hand at engineering like he was born to build things. They shared a dorm floor, called us every Sunday, sent us blurry pictures of cafeteria tacos and campus squirrels. We missed them. Mark and I used to laugh at how quiet the house had gotten. I filled that quiet with Lucy, our golden retriever. She was only 4, but had the wisdom of a dog, twice her age. Every Tuesday and Thursday, on the days I didn't work from home for my interior design clients, I'd take her to the dog park just north of Mapleton Avenue, a small patch of fenced grass near the luxury apartments that towered too high over the neighborhood, all glass and cold metal. That's where I met Julian. It was early July. Summer had just settled in properly. Dry heat in the afternoons, the kind that baked the sidewalks but left the shade deliciously cool. I remember Lucy bounding toward another dog with wild excitement, and I followed, leash in hand, only to find myself standing across from a tall man in designer joggers and a heather gray hoodie, holding a retractable leash of his own. His dog, a border collie named Nico, was as sleek and perfectly behaved as a show dog. They made quite the pair. "Mine's the wild one," I said, breathless. "She thinks everyone's her best friend." Julian smiled, the kind of smile that feels rehearsed but still lands. "Nico could use a little wild. He's basically a furry accountant." We laughed. It was harmless. Just two strangers with dogs. Just two people passing time. Over the next few weeks, I saw him often. Always on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We started sitting on the same bench, letting the dogs run while we talked about nothing. Books, the heat, the best local coffee. It never felt like a flirtation. I even mentioned him to Mark, told him about this guy Julian with a dog that acts like a tax lawyer. Mark had chuckled and asked if Lucy was flirting again. I wish that had been the end of it, but the bench at the park became a kind of sanctuary. Somewhere I didn't have to be a wife or a mom or even Vanessa Cole. I could just exist. Listen to someone talk about their podcast ideas or their terrible landlord or what kind of sandwich Nico liked best. And then one day, maybe mid-August, Julian asked me a question that would change everything. "Have you ever seen the view from my apartment rooftop?" He said it casually, like someone offering gum. And I, foolish, lonely, maybe just curious, asked, "Which building?" "The tall one," he replied, nodding toward the glass tower just beyond the fence. "Penthouse floor." Something in me stirred. Not lust, not excitement. Something more dangerous. The craving to be unseen. To vanish from my own life for just a moment. "I should probably get home," I said, already regretting the pause that had come before it. He didn't push. Just smiled again like he knew I'd be back. And God help me, I was. We always think affairs begin with a kiss. They don't. They begin with a conversation we shouldn't linger in. A silence we let stretch too long. A door we don't quite close behind us. The next time we met at the park, it was early August. The air had turned drier, crisp in the mornings, but the sun still hung heavy in the afternoons. Julian wore the same hoodie. He always did. Gray, with a faded logo I never bothered to read. I wore Mark's flannel, the sleeves rolled twice, my hair tied up in a bun I hadn't refreshed since breakfast. We were sitting on the bench again, Lucy sprawled at my feet, Nico obedient as ever by Julian's side. I remember he handed me a cold bottle of water, unopened. "You looked flushed," he said. That shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. It felt like someone noticing me, not just seeing me, but registering me. And that was the first line I crossed, quietly without realizing. The second came later that week. It was Thursday, August 10th. I remember the date because it was the same day Mark sent me a photo of a new custom table he was building for a client, one with a hidden drawer. "For secrets," he joked. I didn't laugh. I didn't reply for 2 hours. That morning, Julian had waited near the far gate of the dog park instead of sitting. He waved me over. "Hey, random," he said. "Want to see something cool?" I should have said no, but I followed him, Lucy trotting ahead as if she already knew the path. We walked just 2 blocks to his apartment building, a towering, modern slab of steel and glass, a contrast to the warm timber of my home. "Come up for 5 minutes," Julian said. "You've got to see the city from up here." The elevator ride was quiet. I kept telling myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just being curious, just being neighborly, just being stupid. His apartment was pristine. White counters, chrome fixtures, glass doors that opened onto a balcony with a view so sweeping it looked fake. I stood there, speechless. Julian offered to take a photo of Lucy against the backdrop of the mountains. I handed him my phone. Afterward, he showed me around, kitchen, study, bedroom. Everything curated. Clean, not lived in. I stayed exactly 11 minutes. When I got home, I said nothing to Mark. But I made his favorite lemon chicken that night, lit a candle, played old jazz while we ate. He looked up once during dinner and smiled. "What's the occasion?" "Just Thursday," I replied. That was the moment I began cheating. Not physically, not yet, but spiritually, mentally, I had stepped into another life, and the door behind me didn't close. In the weeks that followed, things escalated fast. Julian texted me often, through our fake names, Eva and Jack. Just playful messages at first, then longer, more suggestive ones. Soon, he stopped texting and started inviting. Tuesdays, Thursdays, always when Mark was at work, always when Lucy needed her walk. The first time it happened, our first time, it was September 5th, a Tuesday. I remember it clearly because it rained that morning and I almost canceled. But Julian insisted, rain makes it cozy. I lied to Mark that day, told him I had an unexpected design consult in Denver. He kissed my cheek and handed me a thermos of coffee for the road. Julian didn't have coffee waiting. He had music playing, slow, deliberate, and wine open before noon. It was awkward, hesitant, then it wasn't. I didn't cry afterward. I didn't feel guilt, not then. What I felt was electricity, the rush of being someone else. Someone desired, chosen, unburdened by titles like wife or mother or Mrs. Cole. That night I came home early. I made Mark a steak dinner, watched his eyes soften as he told me about a difficult client. I nodded in all the right places, laughed when he needed me to, touched his hand across the table. We made love that night, and as terrible as it sounds, I was more attentive than I'd been in months. Mark didn't question it. He simply pulled me closer and whispered, "I've missed you." And I closed my eyes and lied to his face. By the third week of September, the affair had settled into a routine. Tuesdays and Thursdays, late mornings to early afternoons. I'd leave the house in workout clothes, leash Lucy, and text Mark something breezy like, "Taking her to the park. Might swing by the co-op after." He always responded with a thumbs-up emoji or a quick drive safe. Never suspicion, never doubt. He trusted me completely, and that was the part that began to hurt. I remember one Thursday in particular, September 21st, Julian and I had just finished lunch in his apartment, the takeout containers still warm on the counter. We hadn't even put them away. I sat by the balcony door, staring out over the mountains, and he asked, "Do you ever think about leaving?" "Leaving what?" "Your life. Starting fresh. You're too smart and too young to be caged." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "I'm not caged, Julian. I chose this life. I built it." "Yeah," he said, stepping closer, his voice lowering. "But are you still in love with it?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how. That night, I brought home sunflowers from the market. Mark was sanding a bench in the garage when I arrived. I kissed his cheek, handed him the bouquet, and said, "Just because." He looked at me for a moment, really looked and smiled. But there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not warmth, not suspicion, something colder, calculating. I told myself I imagined it. The first real shift came the following week. Mark stopped texting during the day. No more mid-morning updates. No check-ins about dinner. Just silence. When I asked if everything was okay, he said he was swamped at work. Some green roofing proposal had hit a wall and needed reworking. I offered to bring lunch to the office. He declined. That Friday, he came home after 8 p.m. for the third time that week, claiming they were pulling late hours on a sustainability grant presentation. I believed him because I needed to, because I couldn't bear the irony of suspecting my husband of lying while I was sleeping with another man. But then came the coldness. Mark stopped reaching for me in bed. He stopped lingering after kisses. He stopped saying, "I love you" first. It wasn't dramatic, just quieter, emptier, like someone slowly backing out of a room without shutting the door behind them. And still I kept going to Julian, because in that silence I panicked. I clung harder. I played the doting wife even more. I cleaned the house obsessively, Cooked elaborate meals I didn't eat. Left sticky notes in Mark's briefcase with reminders like you're amazing and dinner's your favorite tonight. It was love bombing. I knew it, but I couldn't stop, because part of me knew the countdown had started. Then came October 6th. Mark didn't come home at all. I called twice. No answer. I texted, "Everything okay?" No reply. At 10:37 p.m., I got a single message. "Still at the office. Don't wait up." I didn't sleep that night. Not because I thought he was cheating. I would have deserved that, but because I knew something was happening behind the curtain. A shift. A pulling away. I sat in the kitchen, Lucy curled at my feet, and stared at our wedding photo on the fridge. Mark in a gray suit, me in a simple ivory dress, hair pinned with mountain laurel. We looked young, hopeful, invincible. Now I could feel it, the rope between us unraveling, thread by thread. Julian messaged me that weekend. "You seem distant. Everything okay?" I didn't reply, because for the first time in weeks, I didn't want him. I wanted Mark. I wanted my husband to look at me again, like I was still the woman who knew the sound of his laughter and the rhythm of his heartbeat. But I had already traded all that for an afternoon view and a voice that told me I wasn't caged. And I was beginning to realize the cage wasn't Mark. It was me. October 20th, 2023. I remember the sky was overcast that morning, the kind of heavy gray that makes you feel like the day is holding its breath. I had taken Lucy out early, hoping to clear my mind before work. I was supposed to have a client consult at 11 a.m., but I canceled it last minute. My stomach had been churning since the night before, and I couldn't name why not yet. By the time I got home around 4 p.m., the envelope was already there, taped directly to the front door. The moment I saw my name, sharp and angry in blue ink, I knew. I knew this wasn't a bill or a flyer or a note from a neighbor. I knew it was the end because only endings show up like that, silent, unannounced, final. Inside the manila envelope were over 30 pages of printed screenshots. Messages between me and Julian. Our fake Facebook accounts. Hotel confirmations. A selfie I had stupidly taken of my feet up on his balcony railing. The city lights behind me. Something I never posted, but somehow he had it. At the very back of the stack was a single folded sheet of lined notebook paper. No header, no signature, just 4 sentences, written in Sienna's distinct cursive. "You're not the mother I thought you were. I don't want to speak to you. I don't want to see you. I don't want to know who you become." I read it twice. Then I dropped the whole thing on the floor, knelt in the entryway, and tried to breathe. But the air wouldn't come. It was like drowning in open air. I don't remember how long I stayed there. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe an hour. Lucy curled up beside me, sensing something had broken. Not bent. Broken. When I finally found the strength to stand, I went upstairs to the bedroom, our bedroom, and found the box. White, square, pristine. Tied with a deep red ribbon. Inside, divorce papers. A formal cover letter from Mark's attorney, a neatly typed summary of assets, a checklist of upcoming court dates. No photos, no keepsakes, just a legal exorcism of a life I had spent 19 years building. I stared at the packet, then sat on the edge of the bed and whispered, "No," as if that would rewind time. It didn't. Instead, my phone lit up. Blocked number. I hesitated before answering. "Vanessa," the voice said, calm, clipped, devastatingly polite. "Mark asked me to inform you that he has moved out. He signed a lease this morning. You'll be hearing from our office next week. Please do not attempt direct contact." I stammered, "Wait, he's okay?" "Please, just tell me he's okay. I'm not authorized to discuss anything personal, ma'am. But I can confirm that both of your children are aware of the situation, as are your parents." My knees gave out. I barely made it to the floor before the tears came. I tried calling Mark. No answer. I tried texting, "Please, please talk to me. Please tell me what you need me to do." Nothing. I called Sienna, then Aiden. Straight to voicemail. I left messages, choking, pathetic messages, promising them everything. Explanations, apologies, silence, whatever they needed. Then, finally, came a text. From Mark. I know everything. So do the kids. So does my family. Your parents, too, as of 15 minutes ago. I've moved out. I'll be in touch through my attorney only. Enjoy your new life. I dropped the phone and screamed, not quietly, not gracefully, a raw, guttural scream that echoed through the empty house like an alarm that would never shut off. I tried calling my mom. She picked up, and before I could say a word, she started yelling. Not crying, yelling. She called me selfish, disgusting, a disgrace to our family. Then she hung up. When I called back, she didn't answer. I called Dad. He picked up. There was a long silence. I begged him to talk to me, to listen. I told him I made a mistake, but I was still his daughter. His voice cracked. I never thought, he said slowly, that you'd be the one to ruin what the rest of us worked so hard to protect. He didn't yell. He didn't say goodbye. He just hung up. That night, I sat in the kitchen with every light off, listening to the tick of the clock and Lucy's soft breathing. No one called. No one texted. And for the first time in my life, I realized what it meant to be truly alone. Not alone like no one in the room. Alone like no one left who still believes in you. The days that followed blurred together, silent, gray, and strangely mechanical. I fed Lucy. I made coffee I didn't drink. I walked past empty picture frames, too numb to take them down, too ashamed to leave them up. By October 25th, I had stopped texting the kids, stopped calling Mark, stopped hoping. Then came Sunday, October 29th, a day I hadn't realized was so close until I opened the fridge and saw the magnet that still held last year's card. Happy Mother's Day to the best woman we know, love, Sienna and Aiden. A construction paper heart still hung from its corner. I stood there, barefoot, hand resting on the handle of the fridge, heart hollowed. No texts, no flowers, no breakfast in bed, just silence, and Lucy's eyes watching me, confused by the tension in the air she couldn't name. Mother's Day had always been special in our house. Mark would cook pancakes, Sienna would make those terrible poems with too many adjectives, and Aiden would give me a hug so tight it felt like forgiveness for every mistake I'd ever made as a parent. This year there was nothing. No knock on the door. No voicemail. No note slipped under the welcome mat. I sat on the couch and watched the morning light creep across the rug like it didn't care whose day it was. I held my phone in my hand for 3 hours, waiting for it to vibrate. I even texted Aiden one word, thinking of you. He left it on read. When night finally fell, I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop, out of instinct more than desire. I searched for articles about how to earn forgiveness from your children. I read every word like scripture, highlighting lines that didn't apply to me and skipping the ones that did. Somewhere in the early morning hours, I found myself staring at a blank email draft. Subject line, I'm sorry, but I didn't know how to begin. Because what was I sorry for? For the betrayal? Yes. For the lies? Of course. But also for becoming the person I never thought I'd be. The kind of woman I used to swear I'd never forgive if she were someone else's mother, someone else's wife. That night, I crawled into bed still wearing my robe, Lucy curled behind my knees, her body warm, her breath steady. And for a fleeting second, just one, I imagined it had all been a nightmare. That when I woke up, I'd find Sienna making coffee, Mark flipping pancakes, Aiden stealing bites with a fork before the syrup was even poured. But morning came, and the house was still empty. The mailbox held nothing but grocery coupons and a utility bill. The flowers on the porch had wilted, and I, Vanessa Cole, was no longer a mother anyone celebrated. Later that week, I reached out to my sister. I thought maybe she of all people would be the bridge back, the one who remembered me before all this, the one who once said I was the strongest woman she knew. She didn't answer my call, but she did reply. One line. Actions have consequences, Ness. Welcome to yours. It was the second week of November, around the 12th, I think, when I noticed something was off. I'd been exhausted for days, nauseous every morning, but I chalked it up to stress. My body had been through so much in the last month: grief, anxiety, shame. I assumed it was just more of the same, until I missed my period. And then another. On the morning of November 14th, I stood in the downstairs bathroom, staring at a plastic stick on the counter. 2 pink lines. Clear, defiant, absolute. I dropped to the cold tile floor. My stomach twisted. My brain raced. It's too late for this. I don't get to be blessed. I took 3 more tests over the next 2 days. Different brands, different stores, just in case the universe had made a mistake. But they all told me the same thing. I was pregnant. After 15 years of trying, after failed IVF, 2 miscarriages, a doctor who once gently said, "It might be time to consider peace with what you have." Now, when everything was already in ruins, I was carrying life. And I didn't know who the father was. I panicked. My first instinct was to tell Mark. But how could I? What if the child wasn't his? What if I gave him hope and it turned to ash? So instead, I did something I promised myself I'd never do again. I tried to contact Julian. He had me blocked. Our fake Facebook accounts were gone, deleted the week after everything imploded. But I remembered where he worked, some sleek, open-concept tech firm downtown. I waited outside one morning, watching for his familiar stride, his black messenger bag, the smug slouch of his shoulders. He spotted me before I could call out. He didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. I followed him halfway up the block before he turned and hissed, "What the hell are you doing here?" I told him I was pregnant. He froze, and then he laughed, a bitter, cynical bark that cut straight through me. "You're joking." "I'm not." His face darkened. "Well, it's not mine." "I don't know that yet," I said, voice shaking. He muttered a string of curses, hands flying into his hair. "You're not going to baby trap me, Vanessa. Don't even try." "I'm not trapping anyone," I snapped. "I just need to know. That's it." He looked away. "It's not mine." "You don't know that." "I do. I'm asking you to take a paternity test." He scoffed. "Get Mark to raise it. That's what you wanted, right? Family back together. Perfect little miracle baby tied in a bow." I stepped closer. "If you don't come with me to the clinic, I'll walk into your HR office and tell them everything you were doing during your salaried workdays." That got his attention. The next day we met at the clinic. He didn't speak a word to me. He gave his saliva. I gave my blood. It took a week to get the results. Those 7 days were hell. I barely slept. I barely ate. Every prayer I'd ever learned returned to me in desperate fragments. Please God, not his. Please God, not his. Then the call came. Julian wasn't the father. I collapsed to my knees in the kitchen, sobbing into my hands. And for the first time in weeks, I whispered a thank you to the silence. Mark still had me blocked. I didn't even know where he was living. I sent Sienna an in a single message. "I have something important to tell you. Please call." Sienna replied first. "What is it?" "I'll tell you both at the same time." That evening, we had a 3-way call. My voice trembled as I said it. "I'm pregnant. It's your father's child." Silence. Then Sienna said, "No, it's his child. That guy. The one you destroyed our family for." "It's not," I said. "I had the test. Julian isn't the father." "Sure," Aiden muttered. "Because you say so." "No," I said. "I had it done at a lab. I have the paperwork." Neither believed me. "You're trying to trap Dad," Sienna said coldly. "He's finally free, and you're using a baby to reel him back in." "I'm not." My voice broke. "This wasn't planned. I would never," Aiden cut in. "We'll ask Dad. Let him decide if he wants to talk to you." And they hung up, just like that. I didn't sleep that night either. But in the morning, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from Mark's attorney. She confirmed he was aware of the pregnancy, and he wanted a formal paternity test. He wouldn't come to the clinic with me. He wouldn't speak to me directly, but he'd give a sample. Privately. Legally. I agreed. I scheduled the test. Paid for it myself. Mark never showed up, but his attorney later confirmed the test was done. Results would arrive in 5 days. 5 days of pacing, of panic, of hope clawing at my throat. And then, confirmation. Mark was the father. I clutched the envelope like it was scripture. I wanted to run, to find him, to scream through whatever walls he'd built around his heart. But all I could do was wait. December arrived like a judgment, sharp, cold, unforgiving. The first snowfall hit on the 3rd. I remember watching it from the kitchen window as flakes drifted silently past the empty wind chimes. I used to love snow. Mark would build ridiculous igloos in the backyard with Aiden. Sienna would beg to decorate the porch with string lights before Thanksgiving even ended. Winter used to mean warmth. Now it felt like punishment. On December 5th, I received a certified letter from Mark's attorney. It was official. He was proceeding with the divorce. Despite the confirmed paternity, despite everything I'd said, everything I'd promised, he was cutting all legal ties. Clean, surgical, final. The letter was polite, emotionless, just like the man I'd once called my home. But what broke me, what truly shattered me, was the court date. December 19th, the week before Christmas. We used to have a tradition, Mark, the kids, and I. We'd open one gift on the 19th every year, a silly thing, something small. Socks, candy, a shared inside joke. We called it Just Because Day. It wasn't even about the holiday. It was about love. Now it was the date I would sign my family away. I called his attorney's office 3 times that week. Not to contest the divorce, no. I had accepted that part. I just wanted one conversation with him. Just one moment to explain, to apologize out loud, without papers between us. Each time I was denied. The only response I got was through email. Mr. Cole is not open to direct contact. All communications must go through this office. I wrote him a letter anyway. Handwritten. 6 pages. I didn't beg. I didn't grovel. I just told him the truth. About the emptiness, the self-doubt, the longing to feel alive, the sickness I felt now every time I thought of Julian's name. I told him about the baby, about how I had wanted this child for so long, but never like this, never through betrayal. I ended the letter with, "You don't have to forgive me. You don't even have to see me again. But please know this baby is yours. And so is my deepest regret." I never got a reply. December 19th came. I wore black, not because it was formal, but because it felt like a funeral. The courthouse was nearly empty, just a few clerks, a sleepy security guard, and us on opposite ends of a sterile hallway. Mark didn't look at me, not once. When we entered the mediation room, he sat straight, eyes fixed forward, face carved from stone. The lawyer spoke, we signed, and just like that, it was done. 17 minutes. 19 years. Gone. At the end of the meeting, I asked to speak with him. Just briefly. In private. He nodded, finally. We stepped into an empty side room. The door clicked shut behind us. I turned to him, heart pounding. "Thank you," I whispered. "For what?" he asked, voice flat. "For being there. For helping me raise Sienna and Aiden. For giving me this child, even if his voice cut through mine. This child deserves better than what you gave the rest of us." I nodded. I had no defense. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "I don't hate you, Vanessa. I just don't know you anymore, and I don't want to." I didn't cry. Not until he left the room. Not until I was truly, fully alone. By Christmas, the house was half empty. Mark took his tools, his books, the framed photograph of the kids at Lake Dillon. The kids stayed with him for the holiday. They didn't call. No presents. No cards. No carols. Just snow outside the window and a stack of unopened baby onesies in the corner. I told myself to be strong for the baby, but I was drowning in silence, and no one was reaching in to pull me out. January 26th, 2024. The day my son was born. It was snowing again, thicker this time, relentless. The kind of storm that makes everything feel suspended, like the world has stopped breathing for a moment just to witness something sacred or tragic. My water broke at 2:43 a.m. I was alone. No one to wake. No bag packed. No hand to squeeze. Just me and Lucy, who stood in the hallway, tail stiff, as if she knew something monumental had just shifted. I drove myself to the hospital. Every contraction was a memory. Every mile was a confession. I didn't scream in labor. I didn't cry. I clenched my teeth and breathed through the pain, because pain by then had become familiar, predictable, even deserved. He was born at 6:21 a.m., 6 pounds, 7 ounces, healthy, quiet, wide-eyed with Mark's chin and Aiden's exact eyebrows. I named him Nathaniel, meaning God has given. But in that quiet room under dim lights, surrounded by nurses who called me Mama and smiled like I was whole, I had never felt so broken. There were no visitors, no flowers, no one waiting to see him through the nursery glass. Just me, and a silence so thick it curled around my throat. That evening I texted the kids. He's here. His name is Nathaniel. I wanted you to know. No response for hours. Then, late that night, a single photo came through. Sienna holding Nathaniel, Aiden beside her, smiling weakly, and standing just behind them, out of focus but unmistakable, Mark. I stared at the photo for minutes, hands shaking. They had come, without telling me. They had visited my son without me. It was then that I realized they weren't returning because they forgave me. They weren't there for me at all. They were there for him. For Nathaniel. The next morning, the nurse said, "Your daughter stopped by last night. She left this." It was a stuffed elephant, gray, worn around the ears, the same one Sienna had as a child. Tied to its ear was a note. He didn't ask to be born into this. He deserves everything good. I held the elephant close and tried not to cry, because I understood now. My family wasn't rebuilding itself around me. They were building a ring around my son without letting me in. And maybe that was what true consequence looked like. Not rage, not screaming, but being left out of the circle, even as it forms right in front of you. February bled into March like one long, sleepless day. The house no longer echoed. It whispered. Soft cries in the night, diaper changes, bottles warmed with shaky hands, and sometimes the sound of almost calling Mark, almost asking for help, almost pretending this wasn't all my fault. But I didn't call, and he didn't offer. Then, on a Friday morning in early March 8th, I think, there was a knock at the door. I froze. Lucy didn't bark. When I opened it, Mark stood there. No flowers, no apology, just a takeout bag in his hand and exhaustion in his eyes. "I figured you hadn't eaten," he said. I moved aside. He stepped in. That was the first time we shared a meal since the divorce. We didn't talk about us. Not once. Just about Nathaniel, his sleep schedule, the formula brand that worked best, how he already curled his fists like Aiden used to when he got fussy. Mark stayed for 3 hours that night, and then he came back the next, and the next. By April it was routine. He'd come straight from work, hold the baby while I cooked, sometimes bring dinner himself. We'd trade off burping and diapers. He'd leave before midnight, always with the same words. "Text me if he cries too long." But never once did he sleep over. Never once did he reach for my hand. And I didn't dare reach for his. People started noticing. My neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, asked if we were working things out. I smiled. We're co-parenting. Inside, I wanted to scream. I don't know what we're doing. I just don't want to lose the small piece of him I still have. Even the kids began to soften. Sienna would drop by after classes, bring little outfits, fold laundry while watching Nathaniel nap. Aiden helped install blackout curtains in the nursery. They never stayed long, but they came, and that, for me, was everything. Still, there were boundaries, unspoken but sharp. Mark never touched me unless it was to pass the baby. Sienna never called me Mom, unless Nathaniel was around. Aiden never asked how I was. I didn't push, because I knew this was grace, not reconciliation, not healing, just the barest thread between what I had and what I'd ruined. One night, after Nathaniel had finally gone down without a fight, Mark stood at the front door, keys in hand, coat half buttoned. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, but instead he asked, "Do you need anything tomorrow?" "No," I whispered. "We're good." He nodded. "Okay." And then, as he turned to leave, I said, too quietly, "I miss you." He didn't stop. He didn't respond. He just walked into the night, and the door clicked shut like the end of a sentence I didn't get to finish. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, listening to Lucy whine gently beside me, and I thought maybe this was all I'd ever get. Not love, not redemption, just proximity. A man who once adored me, now showing up for our son, but never for me again. And I couldn't even blame him, because deep down, I didn't know if I would have taken me back either. May 2024. The baby just turned 3 months old. He smiles now, big, gummy grins that melt every wall inside me. He coos when the sun hits his bassinet just right. He kicks when I read to him in the morning. And sometimes when I whisper "I'm sorry" against his forehead, he falls asleep like he forgives me without knowing what I've done. Mark comes by most evenings, always punctual, always calm. But now he doesn't sit. He stays standing, feeds the baby, changes one diaper, then quietly leaves. His eyes are gentle with Nathaniel, not with me. We no longer talk about the past. We also never talk about the future. He's moved on. I can feel it in the way he brushes past me like I'm furniture, in the way his ring is gone and there's no indentation where it once was. I heard from a mutual friend last week. He's seeing someone, a woman from his office. Quiet, sweet, never married. She hasn't met Nathaniel yet, but she will, and I'll have to be okay with that. Sienna still calls once a week. She doesn't say, "I forgive you," but she lets me send her photos. She asks how Nathaniel's doing. She tells me when she has midterms. And once, just once, she texted, "You were still a good mom. You just weren't a good wife." I stared at that message for hours, because it was the closest thing to grace I'd been given. Aiden is slower to come around. He hasn't said much, but he drops off groceries once in a while, leaves them on the porch. No note, just enough to say, "I haven't forgotten you exist." That's more than I deserve. And me? I've stopped waiting for redemption. Stopped fantasizing about waking up and finding everything back the way it was. I know that fantasy is just another way of running from the truth. The truth is, I broke something sacred. Not just a vow, not just a marriage. I broke the version of myself that was worthy of their love. And now I'm learning how to live with the woman who remains. It's not glamorous. It's not inspiring, but it's real. I take care of my son. I keep the house warm. I pay my bills. I wake up at 3 a.m. with a bottle in my hand and shame in my chest, and I still sing to him like I'm whole, because he deserves a mother who tries, even if I will never again be the wife Mark once believed in. To those who might stumble upon this story and think she deserved what she got, I won't argue. You're probably right. To those who say one mistake doesn't define a person, I wish that were true. But some mistakes don't just define you. They replace you. So if you're reading this and you're standing at the edge of a lie you haven't told yet, a temptation you haven't followed through on, a text you haven't sent, don't. Because there are some doors you open that never close again. And no matter how many lullabies you sing afterward, you'll never silence the sound of the one who walked away.